Is BBC Five Live. Five Live Breakfast with Nicky Campbell and Rachel Berden.
Right, it's on the front of some of the morning's papers. It's the most read story on the BBC website as well. The Bank of England Governor Mark Carney warning that house prices could drop by a third in the event of a no-deal Brexit. However, we bring you that headline with a health warning. Sean Farrington from Wake Up to Money. This is a worse than worst case scenario. I thought Sean Farrington was there. But disturbingly, I can see his chair is completely empty. Have we got the property expert, Henry Pryor? Henry, good morning.
We have.
Oh,
morning to you, Rachel. Morning to you. We don't need Sean. Let's deal with this ourselves.
Who needs Sean Farrington? Listen, I say it's the worst of worst case scenarios. Can you give us a little bit of context here? Because it's not a prediction, but this warning comes from the stress tests that the Bank of England carry out on banks, doesn't it?
Well, you're absolutely right. And please, dear listeners, don't panic. This is perhaps a misunderstanding between whoever mumbled about the briefing that happened in Cabinet yesterday, or could conceivably be a little mischief-making. Let's face it, this is the season for a bit of mischief-making, isn't it? And, of course, Brexit is something that people like to play one side against the other. We've got the party conferences coming up. There is no end to that kind of conspiracy theory. But let's look at what the Governor has said. The Governor last November confirmed that, much to most people's delight, the Bank of England has actually been out preparing for the worst-case scenario, and he was quick to clarify when he was reported last November talking about this, that actually the bank is not predicting Armageddon. They are not predicting house prices falling by a third. They are just making sure that if, for some extraordinary reason, everything was to go horribly wrong and house prices were to fall by a third, that the bank is prepared. You may recall...
Henry, can I ask you a question?
Sorry, yeah, Nick.
Hi, Henry. How are you this morning?
I'm good. By the way, what about I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse?
That's a good one.
That should be in there for you.
That's probably part of your vernacular all the time, that one, in the business that you're in. Listen, it was seen as a massive mistake in some quarters during the referendum campaign for George Osborne to come out and say, if we are to leave the European Union, house prices will go down, because a lot of people up and down the country thought, great.
Both sides, Nicky, threatened or warned that the housing market was going to implode, or that house prices at the very least were going to come under significant pressure, whatever the result. We've all moved on, I hope, from what may or may not have been said, the yaboo that went ahead of the referendum. The Governor at least is confirming that the Bank of England, unlike the powers that be before the referendum, has done some planning in case something was to go horribly wrong on the 29th of March next year. But it's really important that people understand and that we all recognise that house prices are not, as we often talk about on the programme, house prices are not specifically down to straightforward supply and demand, but are based on the cost and availability of credit. And what the Governor and the bank are preparing for is, if interest rates were to go to somewhere like 7 or 8%, which, it's worth remembering, is what most new mortgage borrowers are stress tested these days. If interest rates were to go to that sort of level, that the bank and the economy and the housing market would be able to cope with it. Now, what is likely to happen as we head towards the 29th of March and our physical divorce from Europe next year is that an awful lot of potential buyers of homes are going to be nervous and are going to perhaps put off their purchase until the summer of next year. However, there will still be as many people who have to sell. Death, debt and divorce drive the housing market, as we again talk about frequently. So we're probably likely to see house prices slacken or dip slightly in the first quarter of next year. But I'm very confident that the sort of headlines that we're seeing attached to some of the more excitable newspapers this morning is not going to come to pass, and we're not going to see Armageddon in the housing market.
What would be worse for the housing market in this country, Brexit or banning all Russian money in London?
Well, an excellent question, Rachel. I'm afraid that the idea that we could or should start walking around pointing fingers at particularly large mansions in London and saying we don't like the look of who might or might not live there is a slippery slope, and I wouldn't like to see us going down there.
Oh, no, estate agents make an awful lot of money out of that kind of money coming in.
Well, they do, but we again, I would beg you all, as frequently happens with the BBC, you're all very sober and you're all very measured in your comments on these sort of things.
Most of the time.
But the idea of going around and pointing fingers at people saying, you look a bit Russian, you might be a bit Russian, you are a bit Russian, it's jolly difficult to actually prove who owns some of these properties.
Have you done
That's
a few
one of the
deals
problems.
with people who look a bit Russian?
Yes, but do we want to be starting to talk about making decisions about who can and can't live here based on what a lynch mob type approach to who is foreign, who isn't foreign? You have to remember that actually nearly two-thirds of people who currently live in London weren't born in London. So it's a question about who's a foreigner and how we're punishing people.
You ever been offered
cash? It's a frightfully difficult one to deal with.
Ever been offered cash?
Have I ever been offered cash?
Yeah, but
Nicky, I've been buying and selling houses for 35 years. When I started in the business, people genuinely used to walk down Pall Mall with briefcases full of cash. These days, life is much, much tougher and much, much harder for those dodgy folk who want to come in and start trying to launder their money through the UK property market. But it isn't tough enough. I gave evidence to this the Home Affairs Select Committee on exactly this topic. We do need to do more because the way that the laws that we have that enable us to buy and sell, rent and let properties should be jealously guarded and are the envy and the basis of many property markets around the world.
And
we
actually,
have
Henry,
to be tough on those who are dodgy about it.
Henry, morning. Sean Farrington here.
Sean, morning.
Henry, and actually, this point, Rachel makes about whether it's Russian money in London or Chinese or Middle East money, that's London. And these, when you talk about house price figures and averages and average falls, whether it's an extreme scenario that like 35 or 33% that the Bank of England has put on a stress test of house price falls, that isn't everybody in the entire of the UK's house price falling by that same value, is it? Somewhere like London, which has seen bigger rises, would see bigger falls if there were any falls at all. And we're not, this eventuality that we're talking about this morning is such an extreme scenario that the Bank of England has mentioned. We don't know what was talked about in the Cabinet.
But Sean, some people want to get on the property ladder, can't get on the property ladder, and this would be great news.
Well, I mean, a 30% price fall for a lot of people might feel, for an individual...
We always forgive you.
For an individual,
it's really important because we talked about this before the referendum. There's a yawning gap. There's a huge difference between house prices falling and house prices becoming more affordable. House prices need to be, in order for people to get onto the lower rungs of the housing ladder, they need to be able to afford to buy a property. And just because house prices fall doesn't mean that people are able to borrow as much as they were perhaps previously. This is one of the frequent misunderstandings we make. But Sean makes an excellent point. Here we are, 10 years after the credit crunch, talking about the sorts of dramas that occurred back then. The housing market, both in this country, more predominantly in America, very much fingered and pointed at as the cause of the credit crunch then. It's really important that we remember that since that, over the last 10 years, 52%, we did research for the BBC just last year, 52% of homes, once you factor in inflation in this country, are still worth less than they were before the credit crunch a decade ago. And indeed, in Northern Ireland, if you'd bought a house in 2007, Nicky, it would be worth half what you paid for it. So we mustn't be distracted by what happens specifically in London. We mustn't get sidetracked, although we must be vigilant about who's buying properties, particularly in the capital. And we certainly should jealously guard the way that we buy and sell, rent and let properties to make sure that people who do want to get onto the housing ladder, whether they want to buy one or rent one, are able to do so. And we need to build the homes in order for them to be able to do that.
Henry, just one more little one while we're talking about the housing market, because it is something we tend to slightly obsess on. You talk about we should be very careful about who is able to buy and then rent out these properties. It was a listener to this programme yesterday or the day before, possibly talking about the impact of the 2008 crash and saying there should be a rule that, I guess professional landlords aside, but that individuals should only be allowed to have one other property other than their own. Do you think that kind of law is in any way feasible in order that it's not pushing up prices in the buy-to-let market and therefore taking properties out of the hands of first-time buyers?
Well, the nation's housing market, Rachel, is incredibly sensitive but vital to the whole country's economy. £7 trillion is what the UK property is worth, and it is really important. It helps fund the high street economy, for example. People borrow money against their properties in order to be able to set up businesses, spend in the economy, go on holiday, for example. These are so it's politicians who play with this with the housing market do so and judiciously, and should do so very nervously. There have been some significant changes, and it's now much more expensive to own more than one property. You may remember the Chancellor made changes to stamp duty 3 years ago now, making it additionally expensive, 3% more on stamp duty if you want to buy a second home. Of course, FiveLive listeners, sophisticated listeners who contribute to the programme.
Oh, you're full of the compliments this morning, Henry. Go on.
No, I mean, I love the audience, and it is a great cross-section of the UK population. Of course, some people would like to see some draconian rules introduced about who can own property, how much people should have to pay for their properties. We used to, 1,000 years ago, when we wanted to exchange property, do it on the very simple basis that if I wanted Nicky's home, I walked in with my large log and bashed him over the head and took it from him.
We have to leave it there, Henry, but it's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to let you and your large log go because we have to move on, but you crammed a lot in there, and as ever, thanks for coming on, and you're absolutely right about our listeners.
Thank you, Henry.